Chapter 5 Social Reform in the Progressive Era. In this chapter, we will be discussing the first social reform movement in America, progressivism. Progressivism was an ambitious movement. They cared about monopolies, city beautification, child labor, working conditions, immigration, unemployment, public health, and so much more. First, why was there need for social reform? At the turn of the century, America was urbanizing quickly. Cities became overcrowded with immigrants from all over the world seeking employment. Due to a lack of regulations, wages were low, hours were long, and families were forced to live in hazardous tenement housing. Their work was dangerous and unregulated. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire of 1911 left 146 women dead as there were no fire escapes. These kinds of accidents were not uncommon. During this time, about 35,000 people were killed each year in the industrial workplace. Unions were violently discouraged by employers, and social policy was seldom considered in politics. Overall, living conditions were abysmal, and poor public health reflected that. Progressivists wanted to implement a variety of social programs and regulations in order to solve these problems. The Depression of 1893, political machines, and constant corruption largely accelerated this movement. However, despite their name, progressivists still remained very anti-immigrant and prejudiced against African Americans. The movement accomplished a spectrum of regulations at the local, state, and even federal level. Regulations were placed on child labor, corrupt politicians, sanitation, wages, work hours, and much more. In addition to these regulations, the social work profession was created. So everything was great, right? No, not so much. Not many social programs were enacted under the movement, and the ones that were not given much money or resources. Single women were often denied mothers' pensions based on citizenship status, health problems, or insufficient housing. Reformers struggled to ban child labor. Workers were protected only by weak workmen's compensation laws. Institutionalized mental patients found themselves with few aftercare services. Private philanthropy still had to supplement these struggling social programs. Like Jane Addams' Hull House for Immigrants, the settlement house was dedicated to educating people on corrupt political machines and helping immigrants improve their social standing. What limited the progressive movement's potential? Reformers were naive. They believed that laws, regulations, and changes in government procedures would automatically solve social problems. Reformers focused on too many issues. Overall, reformers struggled to organize effectively with immigrants due to language and cultural barriers. Reformers found that there was no place for social reform in partisan politics following the election of 1912, marking the failure of the Progressive Party. Now we will talk about some vulnerable populations in the Progressive era. Despite being granted the vote in 1920, women remained oppressed by the cult of domesticity, an ideology which confined women to the home. Women also had limited access to birth control and were commonly subjected to horrific medical practices to treat hysteria. African Americans face discrimination in the workplace and remained institutionally oppressed by Jim Crow laws. Asian immigrants suffered from prejudice and poverty as well, as evident by the alien land laws to prevent Japanese immigrants from owning land. Spanish-speaking people, many from Mexico, were used as a cheap labor force. They were denied education and real economic opportunities. Does this make sense? Shouldn't progressivism have tried to eliminate racism? Unfortunately, no. During this era, many Americans and reformers still subscribed to a racial ideology which placed white Anglo-Saxons at the top of the hierarchy, with the exception of Jane Addams, who supported the education and protection of African American and immigrants. Despite its shortcomings, the Progressive era helped to form what we now know as the American welfare state. Progressive reformers helped establish regulations that are studied and utilized by social workers today. These activists improved political processes, working conditions, living conditions, food and drug regulations, and numerous protections for women and immigrants.
Created using Powtoon.